it's Rick from RC Cosmin Studio, and I'm here today to show you how to successfully paint a peach blossom in watercolor using inexpensive supplies. So I'm sketching out my peach blossoms from my reference photo that I will show you in just a minute. And we're going to be using the Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor today. We're going to use Permanent Rose, Alizarin Crimson Hue, Cadmium Yellow, Lemon Yellow Hue, Ultramarine, Intense Blue, which is their Phthalo Blue, Intense Green, which is their Phthalo Green, Sap Green, and Raw Umber. For brushes, I'm going to be using Simply Simmons rounds in size 10, 8, 6, and 3. And I've got a plate that I picked up at the dollar store. It's just a white plate. I got a hardboard I have my paper taped down to, and that is Strathmore Wind Power 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. It's a 400 series. I'm using painter's tape to tape that down. There's my reference photo, and we're just using a regular HB graphite pencil to sketch this out from Derwent. So there, I'm going to show you the watercolors. They're really expensive. They're a student grade watercolor. There's the plate. That's what I'm going to use for a palette today. So my brushes. Again, those are student grade watercolors, but that doesn't mean that you cannot get a nice effect with a student grade watercolor. So don't be intimidated by that, especially if you're just starting out. So the first thing we're going to do is work on the background. I like to work on my background first after I get my drawing mapped in. So I'm just going to flood the background with some water. I'm using my size 10 round brush from the Simply Simmons, which are some of my favorite brushes because they're synthetic, but they are a workhorse. They really are a great brush, especially if you're just starting out and you don't want to buy expensive brushes. These are excellent brushes. So I've taken and I've mixed up ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and a little of the lemon yellow to create a green color. And I'm going to add more blue, and we're just going to drop those colors in on our wet background, which is not sopping wet. It's just a more of a satin kind of finish is really what I'm going for with the background, or not the background, but for that water. I want it to move, but I don't want it to flow everywhere. The trick with watercolors is that watercolor pigment will flow where there is water on the paper. So I always start with my background to get that blurry kind of watercolory bokeh look, or bouquet, however you want to say it. So I've dropped in more of that green mixture, and I've dropped in some of the lemon yellow in the background. I'm reweighting that area because I want to make sure it's nice and soft and that I get no hard line edges in there. So I've got to make sure that my paper is always damp or wet. And we're just going to drop in some more ultramarine blue so that we have a nice, interesting background. Now we're going to work on that other side over there. And we're going to drop in more color. And I'm really going to let the paper try to do the work, or let the watercolor do the work. We're going to drop in a few more colors. Now we're going to work on that bottom half. And this is an easy way to do this because the drawing actually separates our top of our background from the bottom of our background. So I don't have to worry too much about things intermixing. But I will tell you that I do like to, if I have a yellow area, I'm going to drop in more yellow on that other side of that so that it kind of has a nice flow. But we're still using that same green that we mixed up with the Cotman watercolors with the ultramarine blue, a little of that phthalo blue or intense blue. I am going to throw in just a little bit of sap green just to add a little bit more punch. I'm going to darken up a few areas, add some more color there, and we're going to keep just working this background until we get it nice and covered. I'm sitting there and I'm adding more water so that that water will mix and kind of flow over. The Cotman watercolors are not great with flow. They don't really, they flow a little bit, They're not like a professional grade that are just really going to flow. Like you can see right there, that's as much as really these watercolors are really going to flow for you. Even with that paper being sopping, being really wet, that's about as much as I can get it to move. But I can just work it with my brush. Normally I would use a much larger brush to do the background. Because the larger your brush, the more water is held in that brush, especially with a round brush. So normally I would use a bigger brush, but I'm keeping this simple for y'all. So we're just going to go in and add a little bit more color here and there to kind of intensify some colors, and then we're going to use some plain water and soften those lines out so we don't have any real hard edges. Now we're going to start working on the actual flowers. So I'm going to dry the background because, again, watercolor moves where water is on the paper. So if there's dampness on that paper, my next layer of watercolors on my flowers can bleed into that background, and we don't want that. We want that to be nice and pretty and just ethereal. So we're going to dry that. I'm just using a heat tool. You can use a blow dryer to dry it. One trick is to make sure it's dry is touch it with the back of your hand, and you'll see me do this later in the video. But if it feels the slightest bit cool to the back of your hand, that means there's still water in that paper, so you got to keep drying it. So, okay, I've cleaned off my little palette, and now I'm going to flood in. I'm going to work petal by petal, and I'm going to flood each petal in separately. So I'm going to use that permanent rose, and I'm just going to drop that color in and let it and kind of help it manipulate and move around. I'm putting it where I want my darkest values to be first, and then I'll add just some clean water and kind of pull it out. And then I'm going to take and put in just a little bit more detail, a little bit more shadow color. Anywhere that I might have a vein or a fold in a petal, I'm going to go ahead and start putting that in now, because that will actually dry back a little bit lighter. Anytime your watercolor in, you're going to realize it's going to dry back lighter. Alright, I'm going to mix up just a little bit of a shadow color using the permanent rose, alizarin crimson hue, and the ultramarine to make just a red violet-y color. More pink on the pinky side. So I can drop in a little bit of those shadows and let that start drying back for me. What I'm doing is I'm building up my values as I go. And this is my cheater method for doing this so that I don't have to work too hard. Now see, okay, this is what I mentioned a while ago. You want to, when you do one section of a flower, you want to do one petal, skip the surrounding petals, and go to a petal that's not next to it. Because again, we don't want those flowing back into each other, so that is going to ruin our painting or make it way harder for us to work. So I've skipped over the two closest to the petal I just painted, and then I'm going to work on that other petal. Now I'm going to move down to this other flower, peach blossom, so that I can give the first two time to dry, that I can come back and start working on those other ones. So I'm going to put in my light color first, and I'm putting in my veining so that paper is damp, it's wet, it's going to flow out a little bit and soften. But that's how I build up get my veins and get my folds in there. I initiate those first. I'm going to come back with some more shadow color right where that flower is going to touch the branch, and I'm going to add in some of those folds. Anywhere there's an overlap, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Sorry, my computer's doing something. So I've been working on this video all day. I've had the worst time trying to get this video for y'all this week. Okay, so if you notice, I skipped those two the petal that's close. I skipped that one petal and working on that bottom petal, and I'm starting to lay in those values, working those folds. Now I'm going to come back up here at the top and work the one that's next to the one that I started out with, because that's dry enough now that I can come in and drop some color. And this is a time-lapse video, so it's a little bit faster than what is real time. Originally, this took me about 2 hours, an hour and 20, 25 minutes to create today. for y'all, or yesterday, whenever I painted this, yesterday, day before, today, I don't remember. I know I've been working on this video all day because 32 seconds would upload, and that was it, or not upload. I downloaded the entire thing, and all of my program was showed me was 32 seconds for some reason, so I had to come up with a different way to get this onto my computer. Alright, now we're going to work on this back flower, and I'm going to do this same process. It's the same thing over and over. I'm dropping in that permanent rose that's just watered down. And I will say that the Cotman watercolors dry really fast because they are student grade. There's not as much gum arabic in it, I don't think, as a professional color. Or it could just be my studio lights. They tend to make things dry a little bit faster. But I'm dropping in just, where my folds are. I'm going to soften those edges out with just clean water. We're going to do the next petal, and I can do that one because there's a gap. So I'm going to pull that color out with just clean water and soften my edge. Now I'm going to drop in just a little bit more of that color. Add a little bit to that shadow color where I have that nice little fold. And then we're going to work on this bottom part of the flower. This bottom petal, and this is the same process over and over. We're dropping in color, wetting the paper, dropping in color, starting to add in some values and shadows where that mixes before it's drying. And that's going to help me create that tone, as I keep saying, and those values so that we don't have to work so hard later on. I'm going to add just a little bit darker because, again, this is going to dry back lighter than what you think. If you ever make a mistake, you can always take your paper towel and kind of blot it off. Alright, so we're moving back up to this top petal flower so that we can work on this last petal of the peach blossom. And yes, this is a peach blossom, and I know it is because we went to the farm yesterday. Or, it's not technically a farm. We have a cabin over in a local town next to us, or a few miles away from us. It was Charles's parents' home, or his grandparents' house, and his dad lived there before he passed away in the cabin that you can see in the back of the reference photo. And he had planted an orchard, and they have peach trees and pears and a couple apple trees. So some of the flowers were blooming, the trees were blooming yesterday, so I took reference photos with on the peach tree and the pear and the plum, and apples I didn't see any blooms on the apple tree yet, so. But anyway, that's where I got my reference photo. I took it with my cell phone. Always take your cell phone with you because you can always find reference photos. Now, in between each layer, you want to make sure you're drying your colors so that you can go ahead and start building. We can build up more layers and glazing and getting more of our values situated. So you want to dry in between. See how I touched the back of my hand? Now I can tell that way that if it's dry or not. So now we're going to start building up more values in our flowers. So I'm going to add a little bit more. I'm using that permanent rose, and I've dropped in just a little bit of phthalo blue or intense blue so that it has just a little bit of warmth to it, or a little bit more purpley shadowish warmth to it. And sorry about that, that's the wrong web address for this, but somehow my fingers hit that when I was recording today and made it pop up. So it'll go away in a minute. So I'm just zooming in a little closer, showing you how I start building those values and shadows and softening those edges, because sometimes you want a hard edge, but not all the time. And you see I'm defining each vein or fold in the flower now. So I'm going to leave one edge hard, and all that means is there you can see a definite line. And then the rest of it I'm going to blend out with clean water. We're going to do that on all these little folds and creases in the petal. And I'm just going to build up layers of detail and values by just adding different tones, different thicknesses of paint, basically. I'm keeping it kind of thin, but if you get a darker color in watercolor, it's going to be less water. The more water you add, the lighter the color. So it's something to keep in mind. is the more water you add to your pigment, the lighter it's going to be. Alright, so we're defining our flower now. We're going to define this petal. This is kind of a lot in shadow. Especially, and it has a little dip. So we're going to define that dip. So I've got a hard edge and I'm softening out the underneath shadows. And building up more values, and I'm going to drop in my inside where it's going to be more shaded because of it being kind of folded and how the light's hitting it. So it's going to be a little bit more, it's going to be, the inside's going to be more intense. And I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I suck at voiceovers. But, you know, we'll get better as we do more. I don't do a lot of them in my other videos. But for art videos, it's kind of necessary to do it. Or we'd have an hour and 20-minute long video of trying to paint, or me teaching you how to paint this tutorial. See, I'm just building up more value and more value in the teeny tiny brushes. I switched to the size 3. I think that's my size 3 round. It might still be my size 6. Yeah, that's my size 6. I use a 6 a lot for details, because especially with the Simply Simmons brushes, because they're a stiff brush, but they actually hold a lot of water and they can actually do a lot, and they come to a nice point. Like I said before, they're a workhorse. They really will hold up. I've had these for years and I love them. They're like some of my favorite brushes, especially for watercolors. I didn't think I would like them, but when I was teaching classes in my old studio, that's what I tried them to, and that's what I chose for my students to purchase, because they were so inexpensive. At the time, I think they were like $3 a piece. They may be a little bit more than that now. I haven't checked. I'll check and leave a link below in the video description for y'all, so that you know where to get them and how much they are. I know Michael's used to carry them. I don't know if they still do. I know I found them online before. Alright, so I'm building up that more shadows and more values in the folds, and intensifying my colors with just a little few glazes of the permanent rose. And you can see how your brush strokes when you're painting helps to create the movement and the folds of the petals. That's not something you really got to take into consideration, how you move your brush, because it can really showcase your folds in your petals. Alright, so we're going to work on this other flower, and we're going to build up these layers some more in our rest of our flowers. We're going to define some of those edges where they separate, and so we have multiple petals. And they do that again by your light and your shadows. If something, Alright, so if something is farther away, it's going to be a little bit lighter. And you can see I switched to my 3 round brush, and I'm working on a little bit more fine detail, separating those stamens out, working on more glazing on each petal. I'm going to work on this back flower now, and I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to build up all my veins, and because they're going to be in more of the crevices of the veins are in shadows, so they're going to be a stronger color. Building up all those different little crevices with different values. And a pink is hard to get the right values in, so you have to kind of use a darker color or mix it to get the right shade. So that's why I have a split primary palette with a warm and a cool of the primary colors, and then I threw in the greens just for fun, and the ochre because I know I'm going to need that for the branches to make it dark enough. Okay, so we're going to keep building up our values on our flowers, and I'm adding in those really darks right there, and then where the petals overlap and where my crevices overlap. So we're just building those up, adding more values everywhere. I love painting flowers. Flowers are like one of my favorite things to paint. in watercolors because you can get those real fine details in there, and a lot of it has to do with the size of the brush and your values. If you're doing real fine details, you want a very small brush. If you want you can do some details with a large brush, but more and more, the finer, more detail you want, the smaller your brush you want to use. That's why you saw me use from the 10 all the way to the 3, because each one does different things. So that's one thing to remember, is you want a variety of brush. One brush is not going to do it all. Alright, so we're going to define some more of our layers and our values here onto our project. And we're going to drop in those really dark shadow colors back there and pull those veins in a little bit more. And then we're going to work on this bottom part and keep defining our petals. And we're going to just do this under the shadow there, where the branch is overlapping that flower, pulling that color out. We're going to go back to this one, finish up this flower up here, and we're just defining those edges and the shadows like we've been doing this entire process. You can say watercolors is just it's the same process over and over and over. You're just building up more values and layers as you go. That's why a lot of people only use transparent watercolors, and they don't use white in their watercolor. It's going to make it more opaque. You want to see all those different layers underneath the painting, the previous layers in the painting, because that's what makes watercolor so beautiful. It's all those different layers and the intensity of each color that you see underneath each one. Watercolors, that's the great thing about watercolors, is you see all those wonderful, beautiful layers that were you put down before, all showing underneath the newest layer you put down. All right, so we're defining our stamens now, and I'm just using, even though they're white, I'm adding just a tint of color to them so that I can define them, and it's not just the white of the paper. I don't want the white of the paper. So I'm going to zoom in so y'all can see, and I'm using just a darker purpley mix to kind of define those, because you're going to still, with the stamen, even though they're a white color, you're going to have a shadow on those, and there's always different colors in a white subject. We're going to drop in some cadmium yellow and some lemon yellow for the actual top of the stamens. I don't know what those are called, the little flower thingies. And we're going to do this one down here in the middle of that exact same way. I just wanted to zoom in so y'all could see how I kind of did that. We're going to start working on our... Okay, so we're working on our branch. So what I did is I mixed up a kind of it's a darker purple color. And I'd used the ultramarine blue, a little of the phthalo blue, the alizarin crimson, and some of the raw umber. And that's how I created that color. And I'm putting my dark in first, and then I took clean water and brushed across it and let it flow out. That's how I got my different tones right there. And I'm going to just build up my tones the rest of the time. I'm defining, edges and building up those tones in that branch. Branches are not all just straight brown. There are tons of colors and objects, and you just have to really look at your subject. 9 out of 10 times, a brown object is not going to be brown from the tube. There's going to be other colors. There's blues and purples and reds and all kinds of colors in the shadows. And it's your job as the artist to really get in there and look at it. Look at your subject and paint what you see. That's one of the things when I went to college for art, that's one of the things that we were taught, is paint what you see. You never draw from your mind. Always from something, either life is preferred or a reference photo. But you always draw from something because you want to see it. And that's what it's your interpretation of what you see is all really art is. Now I'm adding in those other colors, shadows back there, and I've done a little bit of, I added some of the lemon yellow into that mix that I had made. And that's how I'm getting those yellowy tones in that fold of how I guess it's the pod of the flower opened up. That's how I'm getting those, is with that lemony brownish mix. And I'm just going to paint all that with one base color, and then I'll come back and define it with darker tones and values and start building up every little layer and add more detail as we go. But I do this the whole process of, again, if you want to really be good at watercolors, it's layer after layer after layer after layer. Letting certain layers dry, letting layers mix together. Watercolors it's an intimidating subject or media, but once you really practice it and really play with it, you get better the more you do with any kind of art. So it's something you should always remember. The more you do, the better you're going to get. See now how I had to fix that? So I wetted it with clean water. I wet it with clean water and then blotted it off with a paper towel and then went back in with my other color that I needed. So here we're doing that one petal down there. Now I'm going to work on some of the shadows in the branches. I'm going to put in this leaf that I forgot to put in earlier. So that's where I'm going to use my green that's from my tubes to defining those. It makes it a little bit different than the background color. So I'm going to dry this now so that I can really start working on more details with it. So here we go. We're going to building up those little layers, and I really could have used a smaller brush for this. My 3 obviously is going to need to be replaced soon because it's not getting that fine point that it used to. So my line's got a little too thick. So I'm going to have to I have a smaller brush. Of course, you know, it's a matter of finding it. But we're just going to add in more details in the little folds of each thing. And I'm going to darken up my shadows on my branch. I'm keeping it in that same mixture that we've been making, so that I can keep everything cohesive and consistent. So here we go. We're dropping in more tones and values in the little crevices, building up each layer. I'm going to drop in some of that permanent rose because there was a little bit of an orangey tone in there. So I've already had my yellow in there, but I wanted that a little bit warmer in there. So I just dropped in some of that permanent rose just to warm that up really prettily. Make it more pretty, more prettily. I don't think prettily is a word. Anyway, so here we go. Tones right here in this back one. And then I'm going to darken that up just a little bit, add some of that same orangey tone up in there. And then we're going to mix up some more dark so that we can define, really get that dark shadow of the branches in there. And I love how it's actually, when you look at it really close, it's got that real purpley brown tint to it, and it's just a gorgeous color. I'm going to add, it's building up those extra little details. Adding some darks back in there where it's nice and shadowy. And then we're going to define where the pod is separated from the branch with some more shadow. So we're just going to kind of darken that area right there a little bit, soften our edges out. Define where the leaf is. Add some more shadowy color behind there. So we have our separation. Add more detail back in these back little pods. Science was not my strong suit, so I can't tell you the actual scientific name of what they are. To me, they're pods. So we're going to add more shadow in our branch to help build up those layers. Now we're going to mix up some more of that yellowy color, orangey color, so I can define and drop in some more of that orangey, beautiful orange tone that's in those little pods, so we have more definition and more contrast with our flowers and our background, which is very important. Now we're going to paint in that leaf. I'm going to use the sap green first, and then I'm going to come in with some yellow, lemon yellow, and add to that. And then I'm going to add some more of the sap green and blend that together. And I add just a little bit of the phthalo, I believe, if I remember right. Just building up. And this is one thing about the Cotman watercolor. It is kind of opaque. So you can kind of layer over some of the other colors you've previously done. I'm going to finish off that stamen on this other flower. And I just did that the same way I did before, with a little bit of a color. Basically, I used the color dirt off the palette to define that. And I'm going to define this little edge a little bit more to make that kind of drop back a little bit. Drop in that whole vein there. A little bit more shadow where the pod meets the petals. Add a little rose and crimson and brown. We're going to add some more shadow to that branch. Define everything, and we're going to soften that out just a little bit. I'm going to drop in some more blue just so that there's a tonal difference and you can see a little bit in the shadow, really intense shadows, that there's a different color in it. So I don't want it to all be the same color. So that's why I'm dropping in a little bit of that blue. I'm going to darken that top part up and I'm going to sign it. And that's it for the painting today or this week. So, and to sign your paintings, it's just a little loose watercolor. The smaller your brush, the better you sign. Now, I'm drying this so that I can take this tape off, because you don't want to take your tape off until your painting is completely dry. And you're going to peel, start off in one corner and pull away from the painting once it's dry at an angle. And see how I'm pulling away? That way it keeps it from damaging.